Okay, welcome to the February 14th meeting of the Implementation Advisory Committee. And we're going to start with a quick roll call. So we'll start with Kezia. And you're on mute.
Here. I know, I'm
Yeah.
like, I just unmuted here.
No worries. And welcome. And by the way, the guidance I have is that we can't just have a thumbs up or, an emoji. It's if you can unmute yourself and say here, that's like the protocol. So, Kari.
Here.
Okay, Marshall.
Here.
James.
Here.
Roxana.
Here.
Becca.
I am also here. This is Becca.
Hi. Felisa.
Here.
Beth.
Here.
And Terrence.
Here. I have no idea what's going on with my camera, so y'all gonna have to forgive me today.
No problem. It's a banner day for WebEx. Well, listen, thank you all for joining so much. We'll dive right in. I sent out the materials to you all, and so everyone should have, I know there's a lot of emails, but the core things you need for today is the spreadsheet of it's called funding analysis. But it's the funding analysis with cost per vote is the one we're looking at. It looks like a lot of you are already in it too, which is great. Then we have the agenda, which I've sent out too. Then I think I also sent out a presentation on methods of distribution. That should mostly cover us. I did send out an explainer about how the funding spreadsheet works. We're not going to like walk through that in depth, but just like noting that it is in your email box too, if you want to break down how that spreadsheet works. So we're going to dive in imminently. If there's any other questions before we begin, though, I'm happy to entertain them, and then otherwise we'll start. Okay, great. Well, so for the agenda today, we have two major items and then two other items that I've added on in case we get to them. But the priority is number one, making a budget recommendation. So that is a very time-sensitive recommendation because the county's deliberations around the budget have already begun, and they need to know from you all what amount you think is appropriate to fund this program. And then secondarily, what is a revenue mechanism, i.e. like how are we going to fund it? We'll take one piece at a time. We'll start with the amount to get the program first. And then so that was going to be the first thing we walk through. We'll have a break, and then I'll give you a presentation on methods of distribution, which is like the long way of basically saying, are we using vouchers? Are we using matching? Are we using grants program, etc.? And that's a fundamental piece for how the program works. And so we move on there. And then, if we have time, we'll do a quick report out from all the subcommittees. I do want to make sure the subcommittees are in full dialogue with the full IAC meeting or full IAC. And then we'll talk about the updates on the charter amendment conversation right now too. So let's start with the budget. The quick thing I'll give you at the very top is what the county really needs is just the number. So like actually before we begin, Becca, I saw you raise your hand.
I just have kind of like a agenda order question. I understand that it's really important for us to get to the budget, but without understanding what method we're using, whether we're doing vouchers or doing matching or doing grants, I feel like I can't make an informed decision because all of the scenarios where we've looked at budget have really only considered a matching program. So I feel like it's a little cart before the horse. If we want to have a conversation about budget, but I don't feel like I could make a decision until we've actually made a decision about method.
Yeah, well, when we've analyzed budgets, we've been actually using a wide variety of methods and comparing them to other localities. And it's a little challenging too, because like they both inform each other. You're right. Like some of the, the more like the budget limitations that we have will definitely impact whether or not like it's a voucher, for instance, or whether or not it's a grant program. Um,
I think
so I think maybe is the best method. Is it okay if we do the budget presentation first? And we just like ask questions and work through it. And then we go to the methods of distribution. But then after the end, we circle back and do the budget because that's just it's very important that we get through that tonight. How do people feel about that?
yeah, I think that's fine. I
Oh, go
guess
ahead, Corey.
I'll push back a little bit, Becca. I think whatever system we come up with, we're in the end going to have need to have a certain level of funding inside the campaigns, right, to run the campaign that people need to run. However they get there, right, and then we're going to have some way of, essentially sorting the unserious candidates from the serious candidates, and it can't be so tight that no one qualifies, and it can't be so loose that everyone qualifies. And so it seems to me like there's a level that seems right. Like these campaigns should have a reasonable number of well-funded, reasonably funded campaigns, and that gets just to a budget number. And then we figure out also like how then do people access that money. I think there's a little way of like, if we said the budget is $50 million, we could have a really loose system. If we said the budget's $1 million, we have a very tight system, right? Like, I don't know. There's sort of a feedback loop there. That's what I'm thinking about. And I think it's reasonable enough to sort of say, well, we got to have a certain number of campaigns, a certain amount of funding. I don't know.
Why don't we do this? Why don't we walk through the budget and then like we'll have some initial conversations about like where we're leaning. And then at least like we'll kind of be able to, kind of ground ourselves in where the group is thinking, and then we'll move on and talk about method of distribution. And then we'll end with the recommendation. So Becca, you raise your hand again.
So sorry. I feel like I'm going to be like the process bug. When I know we're going to have a conversation about revenue raising options rather than just asking for general fund money. We had talked last time about getting some information like a property tax at this amount could raise this, or these series of options could raise this amount of money. Again, for me, at least, it would be helpful to know what we could raise if there was a dedicated funding mechanism, so we could match it to whatever budget number we come up with. Or is that, I know it's all iterative, I totally hear all of that, but is that going to be included when we talk about funding options?
Yeah, so we'll talk about the budget first, and then we'll talk about revenue options too. And I'm gonna, broadcast that like I'm going off of the instructions that you all have given me from the last time, which focus on certain kind of revenue raising. And then I think after rewatching the video again yesterday, it looked like you guys kind of like took some of the revenue options off the table. So we'll do the best we can to cover the options we have too. Let's dive in then. I see okay, and so let's dive in. And I'm gonna share my screen here too. I know everyone's got the thing in front of them as well. But let's just make sure we're all on the champagne. Okay. Okay. Can everyone see the funding analysis spreadsheet? Oh, you can? Oh, share content. Screen. Share. Okay, is that better?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm gonna be careful about not spending a lot of time going in like great minute granular detail on this, just because like I sent out the explainer beforehand and we have limited time today. But I'll walk through kind of the broad picture of what each tab is giving us and like how we get to the final number. So at the very beginning, I actually put a spreadsheet of independent expenditures. This was requested last time to ask like how much independent expenditures add up. For those who don't know, independent expenditures are just spending from groups that don't have to coordinate with campaigns. Actually, they're not allowed to coordinate with campaigns. So if like, Oregonians for the Columbia River is an organization and they want to spend $10,000 to advocate for or against a candidate, they can do it. There's no limit to the amount they spend, as long as they don't coordinate with the candidates or their campaigns. So independent expenditures do play a major role in campaigns. And one of the great concerns is, are we going to be able to provide candidates with enough money so that they're not drowned out by IEs and that they can get their own message out there too? So this just shows independent expenditures from the last two races. I went with our last two election cycles. I went with those because that's when the limits came in play, the contribution limits too. So the commissioner's race, we saw kind of pretty slanted for a series of candidates, or advocating for candidates. We had 95,000, and then against a series of those series of candidates, and for their opponents, we had 834,000. 2022, we had advocating for a series of candidates. We had $236,912, and then advocating against those same candidates, we had $5,000. So we do see, and then sheriff's race, we had a little bit. We had $11,000 spent to advocate for a candidate who ran for sheriff. So all that's saying is that there's a large amount of money coming from independent expenditures. I do think it's important to say up front that a program like this will never be able to match dollar for dollar all the independent expenditures that are spent. There's an unlimited amount of funding that can be spent on IEs. So we can't match them dollar for dollar, but what we can do is provide candidates with enough funds that they can still get their message out, and they can still have a discussion with voters and share, what their values are with the public. Even if they're getting outspent by independent expenditures, they can still have a presence in the conversation. So then moving on, we have the fundraising analysis, and you might actually recognize this from the last time we did this meeting. So we went through all the last, actually up to back to 2010, and we looked at the total amount that campaigns raised. And we really focused on candidates who raised a significant amount of money, and I think were among the top performers in the votes at the end of the day, because there are a lot of candidates who run, but only a small portion of them actually run the full throated campaign that we think of when we think about running for office. And I think so this shows you the average amount that candidates are raising by district. There is a little bit of a variety here, in that sometimes District 2, we've had some races where the candidates are raising less than $100,000, and then District 1, we've had races where they're raising well over that. And by the way, the red numbers signify the amount they could raise before contribution limits came into effect. The blue numbers signify the amount they could raise after limits came into effect. So we're seeing a wide variety in how much candidates can raise, and part of that is because there's just a lot of unique factors. In 2024, the winning candidate for District 4 only raised $25,000 and they won. But that doesn't represent the norm of what candidates need to raise to win these races too. So then we looked at and this is an important note, this is going to be one of the through lines of the presentation, is that we have the top fundraisers and also the average of all the candidates. We took the average of all the candidates because, sometimes candidates don't raise a lot of money, relatively, but they still win. And so, looking at District 2, for example, we had a candidate win and they raised $50,000, and they won the entire race, and that is unusually low for a winning candidate. Not saying it can't be done, obviously it can be, but it is outside the norm range of what candidates usually raise for these races. So Kezia, I see your hands raised.
I'm sorry. I don't want to derail this good presentation, but I don't know if you did analysis that showed the corollary between dollars raised and those the success rate of the candidates, because you're talking about it sort of anecdotally, but I don't know if you have something to show that those that won were typically in the highest tranche of fundraisers. I don't know if you've done that. That might just be an interesting data point if you haven't.
Yeah, I don't have that to share with you all, but I will say like most of the time the candidates who did raise on the larger end of the scale did win. And I also important to note I anonymize the names here too, because I want to make sure that people are focused on the numbers here. So we have the average amount that candidates raised, and then we have the average amount that the top fundraisers raised too. Because we want to show a range. Here's how much we can, if we give candidates this much, you know, it would, you know, do we want to base the amount, the matching funds that we give based on the average amount of candidates raised or on like the high performers? So we have these numbers and these will come back into play later. We have the total anticipated candidates too. Because the county is moving to ranked choice voting and a November election ranked choice voting, we're going to see a change. We're expecting to see a change in the number of candidates who run. Because typically when municipalities move to ranked choice voting, more candidates do run for office. So you can see that in Seattle when it moved to ranked choice voting, and in New York City when it recently moved to ranked choice voting. Both of these municipalities also have public campaign financing, so that's why I pulled them out too. So you see a pretty significant increase there. Portland had an increase as well, but I'm kind of taking that out of the picture because part of it is when the city moved to ranked choice voting and top three, you know, winners get office, get into office, and like all these open seats. There was just such a boom of candidates running. But we're not, the county's not going to be moving to that anytime soon. So I don't think that that increase should be something that we expect to be mirrored here. Felicia, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, I feel like I just want to say, like, I don't think correlation equals causation in this situation. So the city has traditionally had more candidates running for seats than the county, just generally. So I feel like unless there's a county that has moved to ranked choice voting where you can show this data, I don't think it's super relevant for the number of candidates. And we should look historically over how many candidates have run in the county and then assume, let's say, a modest, let's say a 10% increase.
Yeah, I do have that information in the next tab
Great.
over, but I do think it's important to point out that like you're right, the city and county are very different, and other municipalities are very different from us. We're trying to just glean historical data here, but we are looking at the percentage increase too. And so even if the city has more candidates who run, their percentage increase is what we're looking at more than anything else. So then what we did was we took all the candidates who ran for office in the county in the last 8 years. And so these are the number of candidates who ran in each election cycle. And then the average. So we usually have an average of 6 candidates running for chair, 5 candidates running for District 1, etc. And then so what I did was I took the average amount of candidates who ran and I combined it with the average increase for other municipalities when they adopt ranked choice voting and public campaign finance. And that's how we get the expected number of candidates who run. Again, this is a range. It just gives us a picture of the increase here too. And that's also why we work contingency funds into the budget, because there might be more candidates who run. So that's the average number of candidates who run. Yeah, Felicia, go ahead.
Maybe you're going to it next. I'm trying to look at what percentage you decided.
Yeah, the percentage is, and I actually took an average of the Seattle Council increases and the New York City Council, and I averaged them together, and that's how I got 54%.
In general, Daniel, in the future, when you send us spreadsheets, it'd be great if we left the formulas in and didn't convert everything to values, because it's really hard to sort of follow the math. As we're looking at this, last couple of days, challenging to look at the math and figure out what exactly you did without the formulas actually being in there.
Oh, okay. I appreciate that. All right. Thank you for that note. So this is the expected number of candidates who ran, and then I broke it up by when these races are going to happen. So, the chair doesn't run every 2 years. The chair runs in 2026 and 2030. And then, the candidate from District 3 runs in 2028 and 2032. So all these candidates do not run at the same time, which is important for the math later. So now we have like the total anticipated number of candidates, but not all candidates run under public matching systems because these are optional programs. They actually have to be optional based on Supreme Court rulings. And so not all candidates opt into the programs, and then not all candidates get qualified. Usually you have to like raise enough donations or have enough donors or have enough signatures to show popular support to then qualify for the program. And not all candidates get there. So we don't want to base the amount that we're going to give out based on the total number of candidates who are running. We want to base the amount of matching funds that we're giving out based on the percentage that qualify. So on this, I took the last few city elections, 2020, 24, 2020, 2022, 2024, we had 3 city elections where public financing was in play. We looked at the total number of candidates who were registered, and as Lisa pointed out, the city has a historically high number of candidates who run for office too, much higher than what we had with the county. So we have the total registered, the total who actually participated into the program. So, for instance, in 2024, we had 113 candidates who registered to run for office, but 82 of them decided to opt into the program. And then we have another drop off again, it's the total number of candidates who qualified. So the number of candidates who actually met all the qualification thresholds and began to receive matching funds. That number is reduced a little bit more. And I have the percentage who participated and the percentage who qualified. And the percentage who qualified is out of the total who registered, how many actually qualified. I do think the note I said in the explainer is in 2020, we had 21 candidates running, and there was a lot of unique political dynamics at play. But so only one candidate actually ended up participating in the program. And that's why you only have a 5% qualification. But, if you look at 2024, you have a 24% qualification because a lot more candidates participated. So I don't think we're going to have a situation where only one candidate, is going to try to attempt public financing in the county because the county now has contribution limits. And that does change the dynamics a lot. And so I kind of removed the 2020 mayor race from the average just because I thought that was like such an outlier too. So we have the mayoral average, on average around 14% of the candidates who run for mayor qualify for matching funds. 35% of candidates who run for council qualify for matching funds too. So then I took that number and combined it. We had the total anticipated number of candidates who are running for office and the percentage who qualify on average. And then we think based on that number, we're probably going to have 3, in any year, we'll have like 3 candidates of the 11 who run for chair as having qualified for the program. And that's who we have to match. We have to provide matching funds for at least 3 candidates. And again, these are estimations. So there's a lot of other factors that are going to come into play. And that's why we want to build some contingency funds into it too. But that's how we get the number of candidates we expect to qualify. Then we have voter turnout. So what we did was we took all of the races in the last 10 years.
Sorry,
Yeah, Cardi.
You brought that last tab.
Mhm.
The total commissioner anticipated of 24. That's over the next 2 election cycles.
Yeah, that's not all 24 in 1 year. That's right.
That's in 2026 and 2028.
Yes, I believe that is the case.
Yeah, total commissioner,
Yeah.
8 plus 16, 24. Got it.
Yeah, thanks for
So
clarifying.
when we're looking at our budget, of course, for the chair races in gubernatorial cycles, 26 and 30, and those commissioner races are split between the gubernatorial and the presidential. So that's going to matter for our budget conversation, right?
It definitely does. The turnout is definitely impacted by what else is on the ballot.
No, not just turnout, when the chair race is. Chair race is not in presidential years. We don't have to budget for the chair race in presidential years.
Oh yeah, I see what you're saying. Yes, that's absolutely correct.
Thank you.
So then we look at voter
So
turnout.
can
and
I
voter
just build
turnout-
off of that? Sorry,
Yeah, Becca.
just for clarity, so for in 2026, there's a chairs race and there's District 2.
And there's also the
and-
auditor and sheriff's race in 26 as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So now we get into the cost per voter methods, which is what you all requested last time. So, and that is based on voter turnout, because cost per voter, what we do is we take the amount the campaign spent and divide it by the total number of votes cast in that race. And then we get the cost per voter. But to project that out for the future, we have to know how many people are going to be vote, or how many people are going to be registered to vote, and how many will likely be voting in future races too. So this is where this tab comes in. We looked at, in the past, 10 years election cycles, was how many people are eligible to vote? And then we also have the percentage turnout. As you can see, elections that used to be held in May have a much lower turnout than elections that used to be held in November. Because in November, we often have like the governor's races on the ballot or presidential race on the ballot or other, statewide efforts that drive turnout too. So that's why we see such an increase in the turnout when it comes to November elections. So then we have the average percentage, and then that's the total votes we have here too. I then took that and averaged them out. For every single time, like the chairs race was in November, the chairs race was in May, and then we isolated November because again, we're not going to have May races going forward. Although I will say special elections are still able to happen in May. But aside from that, all regular scheduled elections will be in November for these candidates. So that's why we're focused on November turnout numbers. And we see an average of around 54% people voting in chair races in midterm cycles, like 2026 and 2030. Or sorry, 2026, 2030. And then an average of like 61% for presidential cycles. 2028, 2022, 32. Felisa, yeah.
Do you know the turnout in these races? Or no?
The turnout in these individual races, yeah, it's just that data right here in column
No, you have the
C.
total votes, but you don't have the percent of turnout. Right, so did 90% of the population, which I'm looking at the wrong spreadsheet maybe.
Yeah, it's column I on the voter turnout is the percentage we have turned out.
I'm here, perfect, thank you.
Yeah. So we took the average, and then what we did was we took that average and we broadcast it over in the future. And so, 2026, we have 54% of the people are likely going to be voting because that's what we've seen in previous election cycles when we have a November race. And then, in the auditors race, we actually have a very high turnout. For auditors races, we've had 53% in previous November races. Now, a lot of this depends also on, like, is the race contested? What else is on the ballot at the time? What are the other unique political dynamics? What's the, we saw an increase in voter interest, post 2016 that's lasted ever since. So there are other factors at play. At least like this grounds us in the history we have. And then we also have the expected registration numbers. And Felisa, just letting you know your hand's still up. And so we have the expected voter registration numbers going forward too. And actually it's gonna have a very small increase because in general we're actually seeing like a plateau growth in Multnomah County. Multnomah County had like exponential growth in population from like 2010 to 2020, and then it began to plateau off in recent years, in which of course like we've seen a lot of coverage about that. So then we move on to Becca. Yeah, go ahead.
Just for clarity, so column I is the turnout in that race. That is how many folks voted for that particular office.
Yes.
But it doesn't reflect the the overall turnout of Multnomah County voters, some of whom may not have made a choice, left that race blank.
Yeah, the instructions I had were just like the total number of people who cast a ballot in that race. So that's why we're focused on there. But yeah, good question.
Well, and when we talk about if we want to do it per voter, maybe it's somewhere on here, but I would be interested in looking at what total turnout in Multnomah County voters were, period, right? Regardless of whether or not they chose to, because if we're, aspirational and if folks are participating, and casting a ballot, we may want to look at the total turnout number, not just, the number of folks who cast a ballot in that particular race.
Yeah, that's definitely something I asked for you all to weigh in on too. I would say that like it's noteworthy that, so for some of these races, like as people get down the ballot, they do tend to like drop off a little bit, as we know. And so like the number of people in Multnomah County who are going to vote for presidential candidate are going to be much bigger than the number of people who are going to vote for the auditor candidate too. But yeah, it's definitely worth the conversation.
Well, of course, and candidates are communicating with everyone that they anticipate will be voting in that. Sometimes they communicate with every voter. Typically, they communicate with every voter they think is going to turn out, because there's no way to know who are the undervoters in, for example, the sheriff's race or county chair race. That is not information that's public.
That's true. And so then we look at then we look at cost per vote. So this is where this is the information that was requested from me last time. So we looked at the total amount they spent, and I did the 2 years preceding the election. So if the election was held in 2024, how much the candidates spend in 2024 and 2023? Because sometimes candidates start running early. Sometimes they maybe will hire a staff member early or start like building a website early, for instance. And so we want to include that in there. Yeah, Felisa.
So on this spreadsheet, on the historic cost per vote, what you looked at, so this is the number of total votes cast and what the candidate spent on the 2024. So it doesn't include independent expenditures in the cost per vote.
It does
Right.
not include them.
On
Yeah,
the-
correct. It does not include
Okay.
independent expenditures.
And then you don't have this. Is there a sheet somewhere with the cost per voter?
You mean like at the total number of voters in Multnomah County?
Or in these districts? So like if I did District 1, the cost per vote, the total votes was 87,634. But District 1 voters is 148,000, 150,000 roughly, because there's two choices. You do it cost per vote or you do it cost per voter.
Yeah. What we talked about last
So
time
that's like
was
a little
cost-
bit of a half. We talked about both last time.
Okay. I did also, yeah, I appreciate that. I did run the methodology by some folks, but yeah, this is based on cost per votes.
Okay. So it's roughly the cost per voter is about a 60% less. Got it. Thanks.
Okay. And so the cost per vote, we took the total amount they spent and we divided it by the total votes that were cast in that race. And then we got the total cost per vote. And then we adjusted that for inflation. And we see a pretty significant change. So, for instance, in 2016, the candidate spent $2.35 per vote. But actually, if we looked at today's with inflation, that's $3.07 per vote. So that kind of gives us the same numbers we're all working from and some consistency when we're comparing here.
And that's the cost per total votes in that race, not the cost per votes that candidate got.
Yes, just the total cost in that race. Yes, good. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. And so we have that cost per vote. And then I also divided that just for our information here, pre-contribution limit, when candidates could raise an unlimited amount of money, and then post limits. And you see a pretty significant change. So before the, and these numbers are adjusted for inflation too. So you can see when candidate ran for chair, they were spending about $4.43 per vote. But then when they ran for after the limits, it was like 77 cents per vote. So you could see like the limits really did very significantly change the amount that candidates could raise and spend when they ran for office. Finally, one other note I put in here is, and I talked about this in the explainer, that the I was a little worried about the chair's race in 2014 because we had a huge amount of money spent in our race. These are like the most expensive races we've had in recent memory. From just candidates, not independent expenditures, but just candidates. But we also, it was a May election, and so we had a very small universe of voters. So as a result, we're gonna have a very high cost per vote here. But it actually doesn't, and I was worried about that because that is a unique factor. We're not gonna have a mayor election for chair unless it's a special race anytime soon. And that number was so high just because of the amount of spending that went into that, which was, I think, like higher than most other chair races were. That, as you can see, adjusted for inflation, the cost per vote was, higher than anything else. And I was worried about that because those factors are so unique and we're not going to see those anytime soon. So what I did was I actually did a November simulation here. And I took the amount that they spent and I based it off of like how many people voted in the November election of 2014. Now I'm like, we're making some educated guesses here because if they were running for a little bit longer, if they weren't running for May, but they were running for November, they might have like spent more money. They might have raised and spent more because the timeline is longer. But also the timeline shifts because these candidates started running 9 months before the May election. And if the race was in November, they could start running, 10 months before the election. And so I think like the timeline would be a little different, but I don't think it would be that different from the 9 months that the candidates ran under in 2014. So I did a simulation. I took it on how many candidates ran for if they ran in November of that year, which of course they will be going forward if it's a regular election, and that's why we have a kind of a tweaked, adjusted for inflation number, and this comes into play later. So moving on to projected cost per vote, then what we did was we put all these numbers together. So now we have the voter registration going forward, what we expect the voter registration will be. We have the expected turnout. Then we have the expected number of people who are going to be voting in that race. So we're likely going to have 307,000 people voting in the 2026 chair's race. This is an estimation. And then we have the cost per voter with that limit, with the contribution limits. And that's how much the candidates would be spending if we took the cost per voter limits. I'm sorry, we took the cost per voter that they've had recently and we put it over the amount of candidates who are going to be running in the next, number of votes who are going to be running the number of people going to be voting, in the next election cycle. That's how much they have to be spending. But we did the same without the limits too. So we took the same number, and this is the cost per voter when they didn't have any limits in place, when they could raise an unlimited amount of money, and we put it over the expected number of votes, and that's what the cost per voter without the limits is going to look like. Kari?
I'm trying to think out loud here. Think about how we think about this. So, in the limits world, which has existed for a bit here and can continue to exist, that's how much they were able to raise under the limits. In the no limits world, it's as much as they could raise, going crazy. And in other words, that's the amount of money they would have spent if they could have raised as much money. So as I think about this going forward, there's a way of thinking of this is the limits number is what they should still be able to raise without any public financing. But the no limits number is kind of the number that we kind of want to get them to with public financing so they can run the reasonable campaign that they would have wanted to run if they could raise unlimited funds. I think I'm making sense. I don't know.
Yeah, that was kind of the perspective I took too, is, the amount that they could raise before the limits was, much larger. And with those funds, they could hire more staff. They could have, they could advertise more. They could, have a bigger web presence and online presence too. And so that's kind of the amount that they would be able to spend in ideal circumstances, if you will. And so that's why I'm taking the cost per voter without the limits as like what we kind of want to get them to, if you will. And so I was making the same, conjectures that you were, Kari. And as you can see, and this is I talked about that simulation before, but when we didn't do that simulation, when we had the cost per voter, when we were like factoring in the May 2014 race, the one that was like kind of such an outlier, the candidate for chair would have to raise like $1.3 million. And that's very high. And I think for a lot of people who have a background in campaigns, that would seem a lot higher than what they would actually really need to raise for this race. So that's why I worked that November simulation in, and we did the November simulation. They would have to raise $712,000, which I think is probably more within what the expectation would be for a candidate running for chair. And like we said before, I did this for all the contested races, and I also did this for the top fundraisers. So now we have the range of like, if we were to give candidates a large amount of money, we would catch them up to where the top fundraisers were in previous election cycles. And then I kind of broke it down here too. The reason District 3, I have a blank spot here is because we actually haven't had a November race for District 3 in like a decade. Because for like the unique factors of who's running in those races, those are more often settled in May. But yeah, if you look at the cost per vote, for the chair's race, you have around $712,000. That's how much they would need to spend if they were able to run, an ideal race, i.e. like the one that, the amount they were able to spend before the limits. That's how much they would need to spend per voter who's going to be voting in those next election cycles. So for chair, $712,000. But if you go for the top fundraiser, it's $850,000. For District 1, 2, and 4, there's pretty wide variation here. And that I'll talk about why that's important in a second. And then for auditor's race, they historically had not had to spend a lot of money in order to win these races too. Again, that might change, but that's just we're basing it on historical data. And then same with sheriff's race. That's about how much they would have to spend in order to run the quote ideal race, as in like they could have as much staff and advertising and online presence that they would hope to have. Okay, almost there. And so now we get to the anticipated budget. So what we did was we took the total need, which is what we just were talking about in a previous tab. And then I did the average amount of fundraising that they've raised, historically for these seats. And then this is what Kari was addressing earlier. This is the matching funds. So the idea is what the total need is minus the amount that they can raise under contribution limits. And this is how much they're short. So for instance, a person running for chair on average could raise $280,000, but they need $712,000. So that means they're $504,000 short of the need. Then I rounded that number to a consistent number, because like when we communicate about this, it's trickier to say, oh, well, this year you're going to get $516,000 and 732 bucks. And so I think when we round it out, we say this year you're going to get 500,000. This year these candidates are going to get 250,000. Then it's a lot simpler. It's a lot easier for the public to understand and for candidates to understand and the plan around. And also the county budget office likes it when we give them round numbers too. So that's why I rounded these. And you can see pretty wide variation between District 1 and District 2 and 3. So what I did was I just averaged these, and then I took that's where the $250,000 number comes from. So for some historical races, it'd be a little less. For some historical races, it'd be a little bit more. But it would still provide candidates with like a reasonable amount to run. Because the districts are technically the same size. Yeah, Kari.
Looking back on the projected tab, when we look at District 1, 2, and 4, the average is about 300,000, not 250.
Yeah. And so I'm sorry, where are you looking at?
The previous tab, projected at the very bottom.
Oh,
You
yeah.
highlight D1, 2, 4. Those
Mhm.
those three numbers, that averages 304,000.
It does average, yeah. Let me just make sure that is what I am showing here too.
450 there, and then 300 on the yellow side.
Oh, I see. Yep. I think yeah, that's right. But when I averaged the matching funds here, we got 193,000. So I mean, we could change that to 300,000 if we feel like that's right. But I would draw your attention to this final column, and this is the campaign budget. If they were able to raise the normal amount that Candace raised post limits with the amount we would give them, that's the amount they would have total. And what you want to do is compare that to the amount that they need. So under this scenario, a candidate running for chair would be able to raise 712. Their need is 712,000. Under this scenario, they're going to get to around 708,000, and that's pretty close. So what that's saying to us is if we provide that much in matching funds and they raise the average amount that Candace raised after limits, we could get them to the amount that they would need to run a full-throated campaign. And then we took that number and we adjusted it for inflation. And so I didn't change the matching funds number, but I did change the average amount that they would raise and the average amount they would need, because both those numbers are going to go up. They're going to raise more, but they're also going to need more because of inflation. And generally, these numbers are tracking pretty closely. So if we go to 2028, we still have a pretty close track. If we go to 2026, if we go to 2028, we begin to see a little bit of we're going to have a pretty close track too. It's not going to be exactly 1 for 1, but if we of course change the amount we give them, then it will be a little bit closer. But of course that comes with more money out of the county budget.
What's the inflation number you used, Daniel?
I use 3% because that's what a lot of like website calculators use, because that's the inflation number now. But it's important to point out that like we've had a lot of volatility in the
It's
inflation
fine.
numbers.
I think 3% is fine, but I just wanted to check in.
Sure. Yeah. No, that was definitely on my mind going through this. As we get later on, the numbers do start to diverge. In 2030, chairs can only 826,000, and we're giving 741,000. So, as we move on, if we're not adjusting the matching numbers up, it's not really going to be able to keep pace with the amount they need. So that's a trick to keep in mind. But that's not necessarily something you all have to do. You can if you want, but also this is 5 years in the future. And a lot of successful matching programs, what they do is every 2 years they meet and they, rethink what worked and what didn't, and they revise. And so there's definitely time and space for, in the future for an oversight body to revise the amount that campaigns receive in matching funds. So you all don't feel like you have to do that right now. You certainly can if you want, but it's not required because there's still lots of opportunities to adjust the policy for what's actually happening on the ground.
And the contribution limit already goes up by inflation under the county charter, right?
It does. It does go up by inflation. Right now, it's $603.
To the left side of the equation, what they can raise privately is going to go up with inflation.
Yeah, what they raise privately will go up with inflation, and then the total need will go up with inflation too. So our goal here is to always keep them close to what the need is.
Yeah, it seems hard for us to sort of make a budget recommendation to the 2031 county commission. Like they're going to figure that out.
Yeah, exactly. And like the inflation number is going to change. In the last 5 years, the inflation number has been very volatile, and so I think there is wisdom in letting the future decision-making body, whichever one that's going to be, it's wisdom in letting them make that decision when we actually get closer and we actually see what's on the ground here. Felice, I saw you raise your hand.
Thank you. So I appreciate the sort of overall budget discussion, and I would like to talk about with Becca on the formulary, because I
Sure.
actually would prefer us to adopt a how to match in a formulary that then gets calculated into determining the budget. So I
Yeah.
think the number helps with the sort of what we're thinking for the formulary, but if we have a formulary that automatically adjusts, then you actually are making a recommendation on the budget to 2030 because the formulary will adjust.
Yeah, that's true. Then let me just show one more piece of this just to like close out this piece. So now we take all, I know you all have been very patient when you're walking through these numbers. Now we take it all and we put it together. So we have the number of candidates who are expected to run based on that previous data. I then added an additional candidate into each one because if more candidates run, then we have the money to cover them. In the previous city council race in 2024, the problem was that way more candidates ran than the budget for the program allowed. So that's why the program had to was not able to give out as much as it originally said it would. So I think it's wise to build in an expectation of more candidates running, even just by a small amount, so that way we're going to cover the cost. And then I also added in a special election. Special elections do still happen, and they can happen in May or November. So I added in $1 million because in this scenario, that would allow for 2 chair candidates or 4 candidates for District 1. And so it would allow for, it's a higher number, but allows for candidates from different seats to be able to run for these offices. So I took it all. I took the
Common
total
are special
amount.
elections at the county.
What'd you say?
How common are special elections for county commission seats?
Very rare. And so the last 10 years, I believe we only had one. It was in 2023. It was the District 3 race in May 2023.
Well, 2024, District 2.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, we did. Yeah, that was during the regular schedule election, but yes, that was a special race. That's true.
It was an unscheduled, shall we say, race. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So we had 2 in the last 10 years. So they're not unheard of, but they are not super common either. So then we have the number of candidates who ran, we have the rounded amount that we would give them, and that's how much we would probably need to spend on a chair's race in 2026. And then the same for the District 2, because remember, they don't all run at the same time, and the auditorship, and that's how we get 3.3 million. We added a special of $1 million. And so for those 2 years, 2026 through 2027, we'll need $4.3 million. And then we did the same for 2028, 2030. I didn't put a special in here just because, again, they're not that common. So I didn't want to always work in a special to every single cycle. But that's how we get that budget number. And then for the top fundraisers as well, too. And in this number, we rounded it up a little bit higher. We have $400,000 going to each candidate with the district races, and then $650,000 going to chair. And as you can see going down, that actually keeps pace generally with what you need. So if you go into 2030, the chair will need $990,000. Their total budget will be $924,000 when you work in the matching funds we give them. So that's everything about the budget. Before we move on to revenue side, what are people's impressions of this? I know, of course, it's all tied together, but what is going through your heads? Yeah, James, go ahead.
Thanks for all your work on this and for walking us through it. I guess I think it's a lot of money. It's a tall order, and it's going to be, difficult to argue for this, especially against, competing needs for the county. So in my mind, I'm kind of thinking one, maybe we can cut out the $1 million special. I mean, I think we need some, buffer for unexpected circumstances, like an unexpectedly high number of candidates running in a race, or the possibility of a special election. But I also feel like there's quite a bit of padding in here. Like, I mean, the last kind of two things you said when you started this sheet were that you added an extra candidate to each office and you added the special election. And I wonder if we want something between that to help kind of keep it, as manageable as possible. And I do think it's going to be really important to kind of come up with some kind of formula that ties it to something outside of the just asking for this much money from the general fund, every budget cycle.
Yeah, Kari.
The thing that occurs to me is that here we are in February of 2025, and we're basically looking at the 25-26 budget, which has to pay for the entire 2026 election. But going forward, you could have annual budgets essentially, or pay for it. So the 2028 elections paid out over two budget years, 2 fiscal years. And so like there's a big hit here in the first, we're a year behind basically. There's a big hit here in the first election cycle, but then it smooths out over time. So, bummer for the current county commission, but I think it does work itself out.
Other things that are coming to mind for people before we move on to revenue? Beth.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't raise my hand.
Oh, well, what can we go Beth and then Kezia?
Of course.
Yeah.
Just to James' point earlier, I know we had the Multnomah County budgeting folks speak to us at our last meeting, I believe. I couldn't find the presentation that they sent us. I don't know if I just missed it, but do you remember what their numbers were for like the total budget, so we can know like roughly what percentage we're trying to ask for?
I'm so glad you're asking me that question because there was a budget presentation I was given last time. I did send it out, I think a couple of days ago. But the total budget, and again, like caveats aside, the total budget for the Multnomah County for this election, or for 25, is $3.9 billion. And so it sounds like a lot. Of course, a lot of it's tied up in funds, and the county is looking at a deficit. But it's $3.9 billion. What the city did, which I always thought was interesting, was it had a cap on the amount of funds that it had a cap on the amount of funds that the program could receive. And so I think it was like, it was written into the law that the small general elections program could not receive more than 0.02% of the total budget. And that was effective as a way of like assuring people that we're not going to eat up the whole budget here. Like we're just going to be a small investment in our democracy, which I agree with you, Kari, is priceless. And then, okay, so Kezia, you had a question or a comment?
Well, it really is more of a comment, and I think that it's very difficult to use the past to predict the future in this way because there's just not a ton of data points, and with all of the variables that come into play with elections, that using what we know to be true for the past may not be what happens in future election cycles. But with that being said, we have to start with something. And so this is a foundation of information. What I would say is if we wanted to recommend that there would be some contingency built in, as we're talking about, it could be that we identify that there could be a range and it's based upon some assumptions that we agree to or we agree on, and that it is given to the budget office to figure out how they might have a set aside fund or something like that, that they just would manage as they needed to if the conditions of an election were such that there needed to, like it were exceptional number of people that were running or what have you. So this is more of a budget comment than it is what we're looking at in terms of numbers correct. but it could be just one of those mechanics that would be helpful to think about in coordinating with the budget office.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting point. The county, I think, has a policy around reserve funds, and it generally asks that we don't put more than 15% within reserve funds. So I was talking to county staff about this potential issue with like, well, if 15% would not cover, you know, a special election at all, it wouldn't even cover like an additional candidate. And so that's why, you know, we incorporated them in this way. But reserve funds are possible. What the city did is that I think one time it got a special appropriation from the city council to cover, I believe it was the 2020 special election. But it was under provision that if it didn't need it all or didn't use it all, it would give it back. And so like those are things that we can like work through as well too. Yeah. Are there questions?
Can I?
Yeah, Kari.
Well,
I mean, I don't know much about how the budgets work, but if there's a year where the program does not spend all that it was budgeted, does it, as you said, go back to the general fund, or does it roll over into the stay with the program year after year, essentially to pre-fund the program?
Yeah, that's a board question. I mean, you know, I think like it
You
would
could
be
do that?
wise. It would be wise policy to allow some funds to roll over, because that way, especially, you know, again, we build up a little bit of a surplus to take on, you know, sudden expenditures. It just like assures the candidates in the community that the program is here to stay and it'll be solvent from here on out. But, you know, in times of a budget deficit, you know, the board might change their outlook on surpluses for programs too. So it's kind of a board question.
can I
Okay.
jump in?
Oh, yeah, go ahead, James.
Thanks. Just wanted to respond to Beth's question before. Even though the budget is 3.9 billion, remember that includes both revenue and expenditures. So it's really like half that in terms of revenue. And then there's a bunch of dedicated funding things like the supportive housing services, you know, that are preschool for all that can't be used for other stuff. So I feel like the real number that's important to us is the general fund, which is 753 million. And then, as Becca pointed out in the chat, I mean, you know, and sorry, I'll preface it by saying I'm in the Kari boat of like, we should definitely fund this. I think it's worth it, but just the current constraints, I mean, they are picturing $21 million deficit in the FY26 general fund budget. And then to Kari's point, I think your earlier question actually was really relevant to this most recent question. I think the program will have to be able to carry over funds year over year because the elections only occur every other year. So we'll need to make sure that like that's part of their charter, or I mean, part of the program design is that they're allowed to carry the funds. And then, you know, I imagine there will have to be some kind of guardrails to make sure that it's not like accumulating so much. But yeah, I think we want to design it in that they have an appropriate amount of surplus in case unexpected things happen.
I saw that trigger some questions. I will just know, I want to make sure we have enough room for conversation, but we do still have a little ways to go. And also like we do have like another item on the agenda too. So if someone has something they'd like to bring up now that like is importantly by all means, but also like there will be other opportunities going forward. Other points of conversation?
I just had a question about what is the total amount of the county's election budget? Like what do they spend currently on running the elections office?
That's a good question. I actually don't have that number. But that's something I could like try to get into and you know circle back with.
It's okay. I can look it up too.
Yeah. Okay.
I feel like that's a different budget than looking at the overall county budget.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about revenue a little bit. No, but Lisa is raising and lowering her
I mean,
hand.
just on the budget part, I mean, you're basically looking at, you know, if we're going to try and match the contested, the yellow side, In 2026, we're looking at $3.3 million. We're trying to get people up to the top fundraiser. It's $4.5 million in this upcoming year. And then smooth that out over 2 years in future cycles. Right? That's the window or the range we're talking about right now, based on this analysis. Taking James's, maybe we should take out some of the extras. That we're looking at here.
Yeah, and so I'm going to show you another thing on the next tab that actually kind of gets right into that. Let's talk about revenue a little bit. So I think I watched the video again from last time, and I think we talked about some other ideas. We talked about, do we want to raise the penalties? Actually, you know what? I'll tell you what. Let me just show you real quickly, if you bear with me a second. I'm going to show you a recent piece of data I found in a report. Okay, here we go. Share it. It's just to set up this conversation. I think it'll be helpful. So there was a GAO, Government Accountability Office report that came out in December 2024 about matching programs. It's great. It really gives an excellent primer. So highly recommend it. I think I sent it out earlier. But this looks at the funding options that different programs use. So some programs, for instance, Minnesota, they have a tax checkoff. That has some advantages and disadvantages. Some programs just do a general fund allocation. That's actually the most common version of it. Some programs, as we talked about last time, wouldn't necessarily work for us, but they do fund it by selling off assets to fund the programs. Some do a percentage of the fines or fees collected. And so there's a variety of ways to pay for it. But what we talked about in our last meeting, we ran through some of these options, and members felt like they didn't always work for us. And so the county doesn't really have that many assets to sell off, so we have to kind of take that off the table. If we do it based on penalties and fees, that would increase the burden on first-time candidates who are just making honest mistakes here. And so we kind of remove that from the picture. Introducing a new tax on the voters, on taxpayers, we removed that from the equation as well too, because it was felt like this was a time when a strong majority of voters were against new taxes. And so we talked about potential attacks on campaign ads on TV, but that actually is unconstitutional. It violates our First Amendment issue. I ran that by some experts, and that's unfortunately what we got. And so, we have, it kind of limits the field of what we have. There's still options going forward, but it does limit it. The most common is a formula, and the formula then is from the general fund. And so what is smart about a formula is that it's a consistent amount every single year, and that it provides that stability for the program and thus for the candidates and the community. And then critically, it removes the variability from it and removes the potential conflict of interest question. Because I'm not saying anyone on the county commission would do this, but in other programs, when each year the body that funds it, they maybe give it a lot less in 1 year, or they give it a lot more in 1 year, there's always a question about whether or not potential candidates are putting their thumbs on the scale to impacting not the program to get out and thus impact their election. And so when you just let whatever funding body, when you let them fund without any kind of guidance whatsoever, then conflict of interest does come into play, or it does potentially come into play, and that weakens the perceptions for the program. And so a funding formula provides a very consistent number all the way through, and it kind of removes that conflict of interest question. And so most localities do a funding formula, or many of them do, Some of them do it based on registered voters, which is what this commission talked about, or sorry, this committee talked about last time, is based on registered voters. And then some of them do it based on total residents. So San Francisco and Denver have a funding mechanism, whereas a formula based on the total residents who live in there. And so I'm going to show you what both options would do if we did a funding formula. So let me just go back here. So this
funding
is
formula-
based, yeah, go ahead.
The funding formula is just a mechanism for determining the amount. It would be general fund.
It would be general fund in this case. Yes, it would be general fund.
Also, just register my deep, deep sadness that we can't tax the TV advertising revenue.
Yeah. We can't for political ads. I mean, if we did like an overall tax for them, there might be, that might be an option. We actually
just
looked
looked
into
it up. I actually just looked it up. In 1936, a tax on newspapers was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court.
okay.
I've been talking about it for years, and I never bothered to Google. Sorry.
That's okay. And so we looked at residents and registered voters. And so this is kind of a little bit wonky. I'm going to explain this table. We have the total number of registered voters here. We're actually seeing, and this is like why I have some like questions about whether or not we should be setting policy like 7 years out, because we're actually seeing a decline in the number of residents right now. And as a result, we're seeing a small decline in the number of registered voters too. Now that changes. And so like, in the last 5 years, we actually had a boom in residents and then a plateau. But then going forward, but right now we're kind of in a decline. So in 5 years, I don't know if we're going to have more people moving in or moving out. So that's like a variable we don't have information on right now. So this is a registered voter or residents. And then we have like an amount, so $4.50. But starting with a lump sum, because like we just have some initial startup expenses we would just need the county to provide. And so if you look at it this way, this is the confusing part. But we have the funding that this would generate. So $568,000 times $4.50 will get you $2.5 million every year. Because we don't do biennial budgets at the county. We only do yearly budgets at the county.
Sorry to jump in here. I'm confused because this is on a revenue slide and not, this would be a cost per registered voter from the general fund,
Yeah,
but
so
not a cost to the registered voter.
right. So it would be basically it's a formula for the general fund to say
It's a formula
fund.
for the general fund. Okay.
Yeah.
I just think you should clarify that somewhere on here,
Oh, okay. My apologies.
because otherwise it looks like a poll tax and I'm not down for that. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. No, it's not. This is just for the general fund. And so I took the amount, and then this is the amount it would generate in funds, 2.5 million, 2.4 million as we go on, because we're having declining registration. And then this is the amount received, but this is the amount spent. So what it means is like whatever matching funds we receive, we need to get it in the year beforehand. So if we have an election in 2028, we can't get the matching funds in the June 2028 budget. That's too late. Candidates are already running. They need to know if they're going to get enough funds, and they probably need to get the funds earlier than that. So if the election is in 2028, we need to get the funding for that in 2027. So that's why we have a little bit of like a step here. So for instance, 2028, based on the anticipated budget, we need 2.75 million, but we actually need to get the money the previous year. So that's why it has that explained. So then, as Kari was pointing out earlier, it's a consistent amount every year, or around a consistent amount every year. And that means that the amount we receive is kind of more spread out too. So we had like the matching amount received. This is the amount we would need to get from the county. And then what we would need to do is and so like this is the amount we receive, this is the amount the funding we would be set aside, this is the amount we would receive, and this is the amount covered. And then this is the surplus. And so it's a little surplus every single time if we set it at $4.50. If you set it a lower number, lower surplus or no surplus. So for instance, in some years we're going to be down a little bit, in some years we're going to be up significantly, but that's actually okay because number one, this doesn't include the administrative cost. We're still working with the county to get that number. So if we have a little bit of surplus, that means that might help cover most of the administrative costs there too. And then if there's ever if there's too many candidates running, or not too many, if there's a greater number of candidates running than expected, the surplus comes into play and helps us cover those costs too. Or suddenly there's multiple special elections in 1 year, then the surplus comes into play. And then if you ever have a deficit, it kind of covers that amount too. So it looks like we don't have enough money in this year, for instance, but we did get more money last year, so we'll be able to cover that. So I did this for registered voters, and then I did it for residents. And because there's more residents, there's a smaller per voter, or sorry, it shouldn't be per voter, per resident amount. So that's why you see the change in the number here. And then I did the same thing over here for the for the top fundraiser. Look, this is like the top end of the range. And we need more money here. But if we do $5.50 per registered voter or $4.50 per resident, then we'll be covered on that too. And as you can see, it does sound like a lot of money, but it's $3 million a year or $3.4 million a year. In this case, and here's like 2.5 million a year. My understanding is like that's actually in the range of what some people are expecting. So it is of course more than like what the county's spending on now, but it's not a huge amount more too. It's a pretty from what I understand, it seems like a more manageable amount for the county to receive that too. So that's how the funding formulas work. How do people feel about the funding formulas? What are their questions and thoughts about it? James.
Like I said before, I'm definitely for a funding formula. I think it'd be great to tie to residents instead of voters aspirationally. I do agree with Felisa's comment of like, well, if we're going to have a funding formula, especially if the number of residents is fluctuating, could go up, could go down, could stay the same, then how are we kind of capturing inflation?
Yeah, good question. So I think we've been working inflation through this entire time, but I would say that what's important for this IEC to know is that this is a starting point. We are talking about the concepts here. So the concept you all like, thank you, Roxana. So the concept you all prefer, we would then give this over to the data crunchers at the county, and they would give us the finite numbers, and they would adjust for inflation, and they would adjust for demographic growth based on their estimates too. So this is more illustrating what the concepts are. And I think it gets us pretty close to where, what they'll ultimately be. But I will say that like we do have experts at the county that can help like fine tune that too.
I mean, one nice thing about a general fund formula that is based on residents or voters, I like residents better, is that if those of us who are working on turning things around in Portland are successful, and in fact the number of residents starts to go back up again, then we've already built in the increasing budget, right? If residents goes up, that means voters goes up, which means cost of campaigns goes up. And so if we've already said, hey everybody, it's $5 a resident is our plan, it'll climb or it'll go down as needed, and that'll chase the number of taxpayers too.
Okay, appreciate that. I'm seeing in the chat a lot of people are saying that they like the per resident more than a per registered voter. Is that how other people are feeling who haven't spoken up yet, or do they take a different view? Okay. Oh, Beth, you say you like per resident too. It seems like more folks are liking the per resident one.
So
What
this
do we
feels
think?
like one of the most consequential things that we're going to do as a group. But it also feels like maybe there's consensus in the room. I mean, I've heard from a lot of people, there's problems with using the general fund, but we don't have some really smart way to not use the general fund. And so I'm wondering if we're at the point where somebody, me or somebody else, should make a motion to have a recommendation to use a per resident formula based debiting against the general fund to fund the program.
It seems to me that there's sort of three questions here. One is, should we recommend a per resident or per voter formula? If we're in consensus it's a per resident formula, then what's the number how much per resident? $3, $4, $4.50, $4.25, like pick a number. And then I think, James, to your point, it's like it's a general fund recommendation, and we can separately say we have some thoughts about revenue. Ultimately, to me, the revenue side is really much more of a county commission question, because they're trying to figure out the whole universe of revenue options, right? Should we raise a tax somewhere or not? If we do raise a tax somewhere, does it go to the general fund and then pays for this in small part, but also does all these other things? And if not, if we're not going to raise taxes, then what's their bigger picture budget question? What are we cutting? What do we, like, to me, the question of like, how do we fund this is like, we could have some creative ideas, but like, it's a separate question from our recommendation as to how much we fund this program and how we structure it.
Yeah, before just like commenting on that, I think the county is definitely looking for a starting point from us and like a guidepost. And so if you all come forward and say we think it should be this amount of money and this is what the funding formula should look like, that gives them the jumping off point. And so like they might come back to us and say we can't do that much, or we actually would like put this over here, we'd actually like tweak this over here too. But what they need from us is a starting point. Yeah, Felisa.
I think the recommendation, I feel like, should line out the conversation about how it has to roll over from budget cycle to budget cycle, which is a different concept than almost any other fund that the county has out of the general fund. So whatever motion you plan on making, James, I think we should include that.
James, do you want to repeat your motion?
I don't know, do I? Okay, so I move that we make a recommendation that the program be funded from the general fund, but using a per resident formula. What else? So let me stop there with my motion. Felisa, what did I leave out?
Can I make a couple friendly amendments to your motion?
I would love that.
Okay. I'd like to, I think I would like to amend that we're making a recommendation that the county adopt a formula to be funded by the county commission. I would actually leave out the general fund because I think, to Kari's point, if they decided a revenue source later, then let them make that decision. But that the county commission adopt a formula that is based on a per resident formula. Our recommendation is I'm trying to look at we need to decide on an amount. We haven't had a discussion about the amount, that amount is tied to inflation, and that the formula is based instead of on the annual county budget cycle on a 2 to 4 year budget cycle that rolls over.
All of those components sound right to me, but I wonder if we want to kind of split that up. So have one, like, part of our recommendation be that, and I agree, let's not say the words general fund, but that the county, use a formula, per resident formula, that determines the funding rate for this program. It's like period. Recommendation 1. Recommendation 2 is that in order for the program to function, it's essential to be able to roll over funds year over year. And well, I'll stop there. We haven't really gotten into it. I suspect we're going to want to put some kind of guardrails on that, like not to exceed, some amount of surplus or something. But I feel like conceptually, it seems like we're all on board that like they have to be able to roll over the funds.
I actually think instead of adopting a motion right now, I feel like what would be helpful is if Daniel, you actually took our feedback based on this conversation, wrote out a proposal, and that at our next meeting, at our next meeting, we could adopt that proposal. If you need that proposal before the next meeting, then maybe we have a special meeting to adopt that proposal, but that might be helpful because as we get through this rest of this meeting, there might be additions to the conversation that we want to have in that proposal.
Yeah, I think by the way, first off, before I say anything else, I noticed that like if I would ask that everyone on this call please do stay on because we have the bare minimum for quorum right now, and if we lose one more, we can't take any votes. So like please do stay on. If anyone has to leave before 11, let us know so we can like front load the votes. Well, why don't we so you said you want me to like use this to build a proposal and then bring it to you all. Oh, sorry, James, go ahead.
Well, sorry, to that point of order, can you remind me what votes in your mind we need to take before this 11 o'clock?
The most important one is the total amount that we're asking the county for this year. And then what is also very helpful is what is the mechanism for funding it. And so like a funding formula based on residents is like fine to say. And what you could also do is you could say, here's the amount we need. And then going forward, we want a funding formula to look like this. And then we can ask the county to like plug those numbers together. And so the county can be like, okay, like you need, make up a number. You need $5 million. And then you want to be a per resident thing. Then we're going to plug in and it determines actually like $3.50 will get us there, so like, you could do it that way too.
I support everything that James was saying in terms of recommendation 1 and 2 and so on, with the addition of, and in this first year, this 25-26 budget year, we're funding the entire 26 election. So it's more than whatever the formula is going to be. It's a 2-year equivalent of the formula, plus your administrative startup costs.
I think it would be really helpful to at least have like that. But so James saying by the end of the meeting we need to we need to have a number for sure. That's been stressed to us. So
I mean, as I look at your most recent tab and thinking through all this, our high end was basically 5 million for this next election, 26, and our sort of low end was sort of in the, what was it, 3.5, 3.7.
Yeah.
And Daniel, to be clear, this is our recommendation for the public financing program only, meaning it does not include administrative costs. They're figuring that out on their own.
Yeah, what you could say is like, we are recommending this amount for the matching funds. And then, you could also maybe put in the motion, or we just clarify that like, you would, that like, it's with the understanding that the administrative costs will be added on to whatever the matching fund would be. So, Kari, it sounds like you were saying that if we're looking at the high versus mid amount of 3.5 to 5 million for the total amount that we would give in this election cycle, or sorry, in this year, Is that a motion that we have, or are you asking people to decide between like the 3.5 versus the 5?
So can I?
Go ahead, Lisa.
No, sorry. Go ahead, Kari.
I guess I don't quite have a motion yet. I think I'd like to hear a little bit from folks about whether we think we should be trying to hit the center of the dartboard for what we really, really think is right, or whether we think we should be going for a higher number, knowing that it's going to get whacked in the budget process. Those of you with more budget experience would be, great to weigh in here.
I think
Marshall.
Go
Oh,
ahead,
sorry,
Marshall.
Lisa.
No worries. Just overall on this, I think, and where my mind is on all of this is we shoot for the number that we think is right for what folks can run campaigns. And the reality of it is we're probably not going to get every single dollar that we ask for. I mean, that's just what it is. But I do think it's within our purview as a group here that we should be giving a number that actually would work. Now, whether or not the county commission can come up with that money, that's a totally different story. But I feel like our job and our responsibility is to come up with a number that would actually make this program work effectively.
I just wanted to add on in terms of what the number could be. I agree with you, Marshall. We should be aspirational and be clear about what the program will cost. And Kari, to your point about how we are front loading, we're basically, 2 fiscal years worth of funding for 2026. So if I'm looking at the table correctly, we're looking at 2025 and 2026, like lines 18 and 19 in the revenue tab. So are we just, the 3.3 plus $1 million, is that, so it's $4.3 million? Is that the way that we get to 2 years worth of necessary funding to fund the 2026 election?
Under this budget cycle, or under this scenario, this would actually cover the amount that I projected we need, plus $1 million, and the $1 million is set aside for like a special. So if that special is held in 26 or in 27, we would have the number available to us.
So just for clarity,
like,
3. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Felisa.
I feel like I'm going to talk about this. You're doing clarification. I want to talk about this special. So go ahead, Becca.
Just for clarification, a 3.3 is enough to fund the 2026 election.
Yeah, based on projections, yes.
Thank you.
I want us to stop predicting special. I don't agree with the formula adding in a bunch of special elections. I think they're special for a reason. So I feel like what we should do is have a base level of formula, and then if there is a special election, then the county commission would come together to fund that special election, as opposed to just building them in.
It's also true that often a special election elects an incumbent that then doesn't have a tough race the next time, and so there's fewer candidates the next time.
And that's my understanding of what they do, Felisa. Like if there's a special election, then they will do a budget modification. And
that's right. And it also prevents, frankly, selfishly, I don't like special elections on random days, on random times throughout the year, because it causes confusion for voters and you have really low voter turnout in them. And so anything that forces the county's hand to not hold rando special elections and like actually put them on regular election cycles, I am 100% for. And I think it's really often abused. This special election setting is often abused to suppress minority and infrequent voter turnout. So anything that incentivizes that, I'm against.
Totally 100% agree. I think here it's less about when the date of that election is, but for example, we have a District 3 election, regular election in 2028. But if that person elected then resigns in 2029, we have a special election in 20, it could be November 20, it could be November 2030. It's just not anticipated here as part of this, every 4 years cycle thing, right?
I get that. And I think they should set them on regular dates. So incentivizing that. Yeah.
And the good news at the county is we have an interim county commissioner system, unlike any other government in Oregon, that allows us to keep a person around. Sorry, Jesse Beeson, until that election.
I see some other hands raised.
Yeah, I just have a quick clarifying question. I completely agree with everything that Felisa just said. I know that earlier you had mentioned that there'd only been like 2 special elections in the past 10 years or whatever, but those 2 special elections were in the past 2023 and 2024, if I remember correctly. Is there any concern that special elections will start to happen more frequently given that they've happened for the past 2 years? Does that make sense?
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, great question. We have some, if we have like a lot of experienced campaigners here in the room, are there any thoughts on that question?
I mean, my
I
thought
think
basically
anybody
to,
planning to resign?
yeah, to double down on what Felisa said, which is we should develop a budget and a system that incentivizes, not having special elections and keeping around the interim commissioners if someone does resign.
I mean, look, this is an impossible thing to predict. It's a great question, Beth. But look, nobody would have predicted that in 2010, Ben Westland would have died. And so then Ted Wheeler would have been named treasurer. And then his successor, Jeff Kogan, would have had a bit of a scandal. And then he would have resigned. These are not predictable things, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was just curious if you guys had any insights on that. I know it's impossible to predict, but just being that it has increased the past couple of years. But no, I completely agree with everything that has been said around trying to mitigate or maybe not incentivize special elections moving forward. I think that's a really good route, personally.
Hopefully it's never again like 1996 when Portland voters voted 7 times. That was a hell of a year.
So
James, you had a question for a while. Hand up
I
for a
think
while.
I kind of share the values that have been expressed, but I have kind of the opposite take on it, which is I 100% agree. We don't want special elections. And I actually wonder if including a special election budget here and then including something like if there is no special election, the county budget recoups the $1 million or something. Because what I'm really nervous about is that these special elections, it's going to be clear who the people running are when the county has to vote on how to fund this program. And so it's an acute time at which the current commissioners can reward or punish folks who they perceive are going to be running under this program or outside of this program. And so I completely agree. We don't want anything that incentivizes special elections. And I wonder if we can structure this such that we insulate, if there is a special election, from kind of budget meddling by the current county commission, but in a way that doesn't oh, we already have it all funded. Let's just have a special election. Nobody wants that.
Then I guess the way that I would do it, I think the rollover of the fund insulates that, and I would adjust the number so that there's no discussion of a special election or the prediction of a special election, but the number is such that the fund would be able to sustain funding for a special election. So then that says to me a recommendation of 5 versus 450.
Well, and
Yeah.
my understanding of how the Multnomah County budget process works is we can give a recommendation and putting sideboards, they can adopt this money is out of the general fund for the general election. If they can't tap it without going through a budget modification process. So they would have to come back and vote on taking money out of the general fund allocation for the next general election. Not to say that that's something they wouldn't do because they have the ability, but there would be a process. They can't just, tell, the budget administrator to sweep the funds. They would actually have to take a vote on it.
Yeah, so at the city, they have like a process where they do like an annual budget allocation. That's a big process, but then they also have like a spring and fall bump, which is like any extra funds that come in, they kind of like distribute those. The county doesn't have a process like that. So I think the board has the ability to sort of come together and make funding decisions outside the regular budget process. It is a little bit more unusual for them to do so, but I mean like these would be unique circumstances for sure. Okay, so I'm hearing is there does it sound like there's consensus to take out the $1 million for special election? Is that what I'm hearing, or are there other views on this?
Well, I really loved the last thing Felisa said.
Set the budget
Sorry,
number high
sorry.
enough.
Right.
Mhm.
So I just want to, let me go back to what we're recommending to see if I can summarize. We're making a recommendation that a voter-owned elections fund will be based on a per resident allocation. And that funding rate will be $5 per resident, adjusted annually for inflation based on the consumer price index. So it's population based. It's based on the most recent official population estimate for Multnomah County. That the fund will roll over and unused funds will roll over annually for up to 4 years. That the fund shall not exceed 1% of the county budget in any given year. That's what I think we're recommending.
Yeah.
And $5 million for the 2025-26 budget cycle.
Well, I wasn't to the budget amount we're recommending yet. that's
Keep going.
what the process that we're recommending. Is there consensus on that sort of funding formula outline?
Yes.
If that's what folks want to do, I would vote positive. I think tying the $5 amount to CPI is like way high for this. I mean, that means, we're going to be increasing it by whatever, 3% times the number of residents. I think that's much higher than what our estimates are. And the other part is,
I'm sorry, James, just to clarify that the 3% would be based on the 450. So the 450 would move to, or I'm sorry, $5 would move to $5.03, and then it would move to $5.15 or whatever.
Right. Yeah. I think I'm okay with that. The other part is I think we have to be a little bit careful about 1% of the budget, to that conversation that Beth and I had earlier. I mean, the budget is
huge. So I
Right.
feel like I needed to put out a cap on it. So
Sure. Yep.
what's the cap that people would recommend? So the county total elections budget is $8.5 million. And so the request that we're making for 2026 is how much? I forgot. 5 million.
Mhm.
So if you tie it
Um,
to the county elections budget, it's a really large number.
I would prefer it not tied to the election budget, for Beth's comment. I think total budget or general fund, either one I think is defensible. But I think also lower than 1% would more than cover what we're talking about. I think
Yeah.
Daniel included in some of the materials that in the Portland program, it's set to
So-
like 2.2% or something
Great.
of
So
the
0.2% of general fund. Does that sound better?
That does sound better. I can't
Great.
remember. I think 0.2% of general fund might not give us enough, but can somebody run the dollars
I was
on
gonna say, we
that?
should probably run the math before we just throw in a number there.
Do
And,
we need to declare that cap? If we're declaring a
I think
per,
it's helpful to declare the cap because of the rollover.
let's see, what was the general fund number? I'm going to try to pull up this presentation.
You know, let's actually I'm realizing in 10 minutes that we have left, we can make a recommendation for the cap later. We could just say, you know, we will recommend a cap as well. If the county just basically needs a, you know, number to base the FY26 budget off of, we should do what we need to do to get them a number, and we should tell them we are working on a cap. And we should kick that down the road.
Yeah, that's really helpful because like we do want to give this over to them, and then like when they crunch it based on their own data, they'll give us a number and like what the formula would give us, and then we could say, all right, well then that formula is going to give us this amount, and then we can like base the cap off that too. So that's fair. Okay, we have 9 minutes left. Do we have a motion on the table?
Based on that math, the amount for the 2026 would be what? Because you need to move it to $5. So you think it's the math is still $5 billion. The math is still $5 million.
Yeah, Daniel, can you reshare your screen and update some of these numbers so we can see?
Sure. Okay. Everyone can see my screen now. Okay. So let's see. So you want me to take out the $1 million here that we have? Well, actually, this is the one that needs the $5 million. You want me to take out the $1.3 million here for special election?
Residents, not registered voters.
Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, apologies. Okay, so I'm going to take out the 1.3 million. Okay. Okay, there you go.
Well,
And what
so
other edits?
ultimately, sorry, if we're recommending $5 per resident and you multiplied 775,000 and some change by 5, what does that get us to?
Let's see. Okay, so around 3.8 million for subsequent years.
So for
And then you can
2026, the recommendation for the budget would be 3.8 million.
Yes, and let me just going back to anticipated budget here. We have
Wait, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
can I? The $5 estimate, now I'm just like looking at this math. The $5 estimate includes all of the amount that we'd spend on each race, right?
Right.
Great.
And then the this 4.545 number is the anticipated budget for this year. Does not include a special. Just like letting you know, that's where the 4.45 number is. So this number here does not include a special.
So are we then recommending whatever line that is, line 19, row L, 3.875 is what we will need if we're tying $5 to current residents to fully fund the
Yeah.
program without the administrative cost.
Yeah, I would note that like this. So for this year, we're gonna have to ask for a lump sum, just because we have like other costs involved. And we don't have anything rolling over yet, so we have to make sure we have enough to cover the first election cycle. So if we're gonna need $4.5 million, the 3.8 is not gonna cover it. So that's why we need to start with 5 million or in that range, and then we start rolling things over. Then we will start being able to cover it.
There will be increased costs, obviously, in year one, getting the staff up to date and buying the technical systems and stuff.
Totally. Okay.
Daniel, do we have, I can't remember when they presented on the budget in terms of the timeline. I know that departments are putting together their recommended budgets to give to the chair. Do we have a sense on what the elections office budget will be? I mean, I hope that it includes, more money for voter education, since it'll be the inaugural year for RCV and But is there anything public about what the elections budget recommendation?
Not yet. Those numbers are actually due today for most other divisions. We have, we don't have to have the finalized number today, but we have to have from this meeting the recommendation. But yeah, the elections division, theirs is due today, so we haven't seen it yet, as far as I know. Okay.
You can tell them to add $1 million to that recommendation.
Do we want to restate the motion?
I put it
I
out
love
in the chat.
Felisa's. That looks really good, Felisa. Did you do the quick math on that 0.5%? Is that fine? Can
No,
somebody?
I'm trying to do the math right now. Hold on.
Okay. And if we use a general fund of 753 million, I don't think that's enough, right? Because 1% would be 7 million, basically, right? Let's just set it at 1% and call it done. 1% of general fund.
Oh, so you all do want to set a cap for today?
Oh, right. Yeah, we could just kick that down the road, please.
Yeah, it's a little small. It's 3.7 million.
Let's revisit the cap part, but Felisa, would you be willing to make the recommendation or the motion up to the fund rollover part?
I feel pretty strong. I'm unclear. Is this going to the county commission when?
Well, first what we'll do is we'll have initial conversations with them, and we'll also give this over to the budget office to start running those numbers. So if you give the formula, and if you give the formula, then we can give it to the budget office and they can start looking at exactly what that's going to pull. And then if we give the amount that we need, so $5 million, 4.5, whatever, for this election cycle, then I think we're probably going to take that to the board for at least initial conversations soon.
Okay, so I feel like whatever goes to the county commission needs to include the cap. So I'm fine moving it to 1% or a different percentage right now, but I feel like it needs to. Can you stop sharing your screen for a minute, Daniel, so we can see people? I think it needs to include the cap right now. Whatever goes to the county commission needs to include the cap. So if I thought we were going to have another meeting before this went to the county commission, then I would say, yeah, let's revisit.
Okay,
I
then I
totally
think let's
agree.
just set it at 1%.
Yeah. And my understanding is that really the first place it needs to go after the budget office kind of runs the numbers is to the chair's office, because ideally the chair is including it in her recommended budget.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna I move that we adopt a proposal for Multnomah County voter-owned elections to create the voter-owned elections fund that helps strengthen democracy, promote fair elections. All of these things that are in here. That the voter formula would be based on a per resident allocation to ensure equitable and predictable funding. The formula would be as follows. The funding rate would be $5 per resident, adjusted annually for inflation based on the Consumer Price Index. That it would be based on the most recent population estimate for Multnomah County. The fund would roll over, and unused funds would roll over annually for up to 4 years, and that there would be a cap on the fund not to exceed 2% of the total county general fund in any given year.
Do we have a second?
I will second that motion.
Are we adding in a hard number for 2025, 26?
I'm not doing that here. I'm getting us to agree on the proposal first.
Yeah. Second step is a hard number. Okay, so we have a second. I'm going to go through. I have to do a roll call, and I have to say names. You have to say aye, or abstain or whatever. Becca.
Aye.
Felisa. Felisa, can you say it again? You were muted.
Aye.
Marshall,
Aye.
Kari,
Aye.
James,
Aye.
Beth.
Aye.
Okay, wow, amazing. And then the second thing is a hard number too. And do we have a motion on that?
And just to clarify, so the 3.87 is what is needed to fully fund the 2026 matching program. We do want to put a little extra padding because it's a ramp up year, or we've said like 4.5, 5 million, you know,
Yeah.
what does the 5
Five-
million get us?
5 million is actually what we need because we expect the next election cycle to be 4.5 million total.
Got it. Okay, great.
Under this scenario. And then going forward, you know, based on the calculations, we'll be bringing in less than $5 million, or we'll be asking less than $5 million going forward, but we will need them because we'll be rolling over funds.
I move that we adopt a $5 million startup cost to create the voter-owned elections fund for the county to approve the fund for the 2026 election cycle. That will include the current formula that we are recommending to the county, but also additional startup costs to establish the fund.
I
So
second.
5 million plus administrative costs is determined by the county.
Yeah, actually, probably it's best to phrase it like that. Just in
Okay,
case.
I withdraw my motion, I guess.
You can just amend it too.
The 5 million included the I mean,
I thought so too.
yeah, that gives another 500,000.
Yeah, I
beyond
just think
what
it's
we
probably
predict.
we're just beginning those conversations at the county. We also have like a website to start up too. So like a reporting website.
I recommend that the county adopt I'm gonna make a motion. I withdrew my previous motion. I'm gonna make a new one. I make a motion that we adopt a $5 million startup fund as a recommendation to the county budget office, and that the county budget office develop a clear budget for what the startup costs will be and outline given the administrative costs, and bring that full budget to the county commission.
I'll
That's a
second
motion.
that.
We got a second. Okay. Going through the vote again. Becca,
Aye.
Felisa,
Aye.
Marshall,
Aye.
Kari,
Aye.
James,
Aye.
Beth.
Aye.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate your work and effort. And this has been very productive. Before I let you go, I want to say like this is the second time that we haven't been able to get to the methods of distribution presentation because budget takes a long time too. And so I want to make sure we all have that. I can for sure put it on the calendar for the next time. But I'm wondering if there's like ways to quicken the process. And so I was thinking like I've sent it out to you beforehand. If you want, we could hold a meeting before the next time and just focus on that. Or I could like maybe record a version of it and send it out to like a link to you to watch. Or we can just like wait until the next time we'll be meeting, which I think is February 24th. What do you all want to do in the methods of distribution question? Or do you have any guidance for me on that?
I think if you had a presentation that you wanted to record in advance and send it around, that'd be all right.
Okay. And again,
Yeah,
we'll
I
send
like
it-
that. I was just gonna say I like that too, but I also we need designated time to be in conversation about it. But it'd
Yep.
be nice to have some, baseline information coming into it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and like if I do it that way, I would send you the video and then like we'll have time to discuss it. And I'll like give an overview of what the presentation found, but at least like we won't spend time going through like the nitty-gritty that, because I could just send you the video of it too. Okay. Well, thank you all so much. We do need a motion to adjourn. And
So
then we need a
moved.
second.
I second.
Okay. All right. Sorry, real quickly. Becca,
Aye.
Lisa,
Aye.
Marshall,
I
Kari,
Aye.
James,
Aye.
Beth.
Aye.
All right. Thank you all so much for your time. Have a lovely weekend.
You too.